Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, as it is for our guest. Welcome to Post-Hoc Live. I am Drew Armstrong, the executive editor of Endpoints News. It is Friday, August 1st, and today we are going to be talking about China's biotech boom. This is the second part of what is probably going to be a lot of shows we do on this topic, and I think it's probably the most important story going on in biopharma right now. For the last year, almost every conversation I've had with a biotech exec, investor, or analyst brings up China. We talk about it for a long time. It is the inescapable subject for a lot of people in this industry. I'm sure that most of you have been paying attention, especially if you're joining us today. But if you haven't, a great place to start is Jefferies China biotech analyst Cui Cui, her note from last month called Shopping in China's Biotech Supermarket. It is a comprehensive look at the China biotech scene, how it operates, what US companies want and why they want it. I think it's an awesome one-stop shop to look at what's happening. And Shweta is absolutely one of the people to be following on this topic. Now, if you are joining us for the first time on Post-Hoc Live, hello and welcome. We bring you the reporting, the analysis, and the debate that usually happens behind the scenes in our newsroom and put it right in front of you. If you're joining us on YouTube and you're not already following us, please hit the little subscribe button at the bottom of the screen. You'll get alerts about future live streams. You can also sign up for our Post-Hoc email on your Endpoints News subscription page. Now, if you are on YouTube today, you can use the little chat function to ask questions. Our producer, Nicole Wetzman, is keeping an eye on those and will feed them to me. We'll try to get to them if we have some great ones. And if you miss us live, you can also catch us on YouTube later, as well as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So, Shui, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us. You are meeting us here from Hong Kong. I know it is late at night for you. I'm sure that happens quite a bit in your role, especially right now. So one, thank you for doing that for us. Will you talk to me? I think it's been interesting to watch kind of the ebb and flow of US and European biopharma's interest and positioning around China. You joined this job. Will you tell us just how you ended up in the role as China biotech analyst, what Jefferies was thinking, and kind of why you and the bank felt like, okay, right now we need someone really focused on this. Walk us through kind of how you ended up where you are right now, and then we're going to get into everything that's going on in the sector.
So thank you so much, for having me here. So I would say this is the most interesting Friday night for me in quite a long time. And actually, as you mentioned, that it is very late here in Hong Kong, but in fact, because I think I have been on the road for already 3 months already, doing nonstop global marketing. So you see that is the popularity and also demand for China biotech at this time. So yeah, great time. And back to why I'm here for this job. So I, together with my team, we joined Jefferies Hong Kong in September last year. I think because as we know, Jefferies has a very, very strong franchise in global healthcare. I think definitely they're the top one bank in healthcare in both kind of the banking as well as research. So that's the idea that Jefferies, they also want to beef up their Asia research in terms of healthcare. So I guess maybe we are lucky enough to be the last piece of the puzzle. So that is how we end up here. And before Jefferies, I was at UBS Asset Management as a buy-side healthcare analyst for the past 3 years. And before that, I was the head of China healthcare research for Citibank. And before I joined the financial industry, I also spent a very little bit of the time into the Johnson & Johnson Emerging Market Innovation Center doing cosmetics R&D. So that is fun as well. But it's a different kind of thing
Yeah.
versus this kind of equity research.
Well, I want to, first of all, I should also apologize to our viewers. I have a little bit of cold, so if you see me working on a tea or if my voice sounds a little gravelly, that's why. So hopefully we'll get through the show without incident there. But Trisha, can you explain to me? I mean, we have seen, and you have this in your note, and I thought this was this incredibly telling stat that, if you look at the percentage of BD value this year, something I believe, what, 32% of the global BD value has been for China companies. It's a huge number of the actual number of deals as well. Why right now are US and European multinat pharmas, like why is China the number one focus for them? And let's spend a while here. I mean, like why is this happening now? Why is the one thing they're interested in, as opposed to the places where they've traditionally filled their pipelines, which is, you know, biotech startups out of, the San Francisco Bay and Cambridge, Massachusetts areas.
Maybe also Japanese farmer as well. Yeah, and maybe because the 32% of the deals coming from China is definitely eye-catching, and because this number was only 21% in 2023 and 2024, and prior to that, it's actually only single digits. So that's the most relevant question right now. I guess two reasons. So first of all, from the multinational company perspective, I think they are facing increasing pressure from on one hand side, definitely because I think to lower down the drug price in the US has become one of the top priority for the US government. I mean, for either party. So I guess that's one of the reasons. And on the other hand, because we know that starting from 2027 onwards, a lot of the blockbuster drug patent expiry will also be imminent. For example, like Keytruda patent expire in 2028. That is the best seller in human history, right? So with all of the factors combined, I do think that the multinational companies, they are pursuing for cost flexibility to trying to find some more like easier or affordable options to replenish their pipeline. And from the Chinese guys' perspective, I think a lot of changes starting from 2018. Why I mentioned 2018? Because it is relevant. Because first of all, for the first time in 2018, we are having this so-called VBP, which is the volume bundle procurement for generic drugs. So during that time, it's actually very scary because we saw a lot of these highlight news, like 90% price cut for Chinese generic drugs. But in the meantime, government, they have a lot of initiatives to encourage innovation. So on one hand side, they are cutting prices for generic drugs. On the other hand, they have a lot of promotion for the innovative ones. So that also force the Chinese pharma companies to have this faster transition from generics to more innovative. And remember, like 2018 is also the year that the Hong Kong Exchange just opened up the Chapter 18A to allow the pre-revenue biotech companies to list on Hong Kong. So previously, that is only allowed in NASDAQ, but now they definitely have a second option that they can also do this within their continent. So I guess that's the reason why. But more importantly, I want to mention a company here which is Akeso. So I would say, all of this kind of acceleration of Chinese biotech out licensing is thanks to Akeso. Why? Because like 7 years ago, even like 10 years ago, I think many like global physicians, global investors, they are skeptical about China only data. But Akeso for this year, because of the Harmony trial, they did this together with the partner summit in the US. The Harmony trial has already demonstrated that the Chinese data can be reliable and also can be translated into global population. So I guess that is definitely very, very important for the multinational companies to look into China.
Yeah, and for I'm sure most of our listeners know this, but Akeso is the biotech company that's partnered with Summit Therapeutics on their PD-1 VEGF drug, which has become suddenly one of the most popular classes in the world in terms of thinking about what are the successors or kind of follow-up drugs to Keytruda. So you mentioned something that there's a ton that I want to get into here. I think you mentioned the data question, which I want to spend some time on because there have been a bunch of comments in the last actually few days from the US, some US regulators about this that I'm sure people have been paying attention to as well. I do want to ask you about the talent flow as well. I mean, because I think that, obviously opening up the Hong Kong exchange to pre-revenue biotechs, letting capital flow, this push to get, more innovative drugs and push away from generics, obviously really, really important. People also talk about, and I think one of the things when I was over in China in 2019, you saw is, this enormous flow of talent from US and European companies with a lot of people who were born in China and are coming back. How much of a factor has that been in terms of this explosion, I think in particular of new, small, and innovative companies? And we'll spend a lot of time on the startup scene and why the startup scene and kind of the early stage companies are exploding so much. But how much of that talent flow is a factor as well?
So I would say talent flow is definitely important, but might not be as important as everybody assume. Why? Because, for example, we also have some um, like the local farmer companies, while majority of the talent is just coming from the local company, the local university. For example, we also have a very top university in China. They are having very high like the technology as well as the R&D capability. So I'm pretty sure that because like most of the biologic scientists, like the university students, some of them they will pursue a PhD in the US to receive the definitely the cutting edge technology education here. But in the meantime, a lot of talent they decided they just want to stay in China. So I guess this is definitely important, but might not be the most critical part. And on the other hand, I would say, yeah, we did see a lot of the like entrepreneurs, they're returning to China from multinational companies. But I think this is good for both parties because the thing is nowadays, I guess a lot of the acceleration from this kind of partnership is also because this kind of, I don't know whether it is called bonding or relationship with their old employers. And I'm pretty sure that most scientists they are still retaining very good relationship with their former employers.
How much of the deal making that we're seeing right now do you think is driven by the price of the assets that are available? And I ask that, with the backdrop, I and a lot of people have been for years kind of looking at the huge sums that are being raised by early stage startups in the US and, the cost of doing, a lot of this, of the work to build a startup. And, I think I've been asking the question. I remember asking it years ago, just like, why is this so expensive to do here? And
Yeah.
is that really going to be sustainable? And then, I think that there's an idea in a lot of people's minds that why would you go and buy one of these assets from a US startup for potentially multiple billions of dollars, or a really big upfront deal when you can go and buy something very similar, when you can, as your note says, you can go to the Chinese biotech supermarket and see a number of competitive similar assets, potentially place a couple of bets that look very competitive. How much do you think this is about that kind of, price arbitrage issue that seems to still be in place? And then I think as a follow-up, will we see that kind of shift back into a little bit more rational competitive place where US, startup prices come down and Chinese biotech startup prices come up?
Yeah, so very good question. So starting from the pricing part, I will say definitely price is very important. So that's why I mentioned at the very beginning, because like the multinational companies, they are facing increasing pressure. So that's the reason why they want to achieve this kind of cost efficiency. And we do have the statistics that if you're in licensing from China for the similar asset class, you can save the expenses by 60 to 70%. But more importantly, in the meantime, it's actually 30 to 50% faster. Why is that? Because first of all, like China is sitting on a very large population, so we have the patient, like the patient population diversity, and also the patient recruitment, the cost, and also it's definitely cheaper and also it's faster. And on the other hand, because the overall drug pricing system in China is definitely much cheaper than the US. For example, Keytruda is 80% cheaper than the US, right? So
Yeah.
if you're going to
Which
do
which
like a
is
TISO,
really
yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah, and people
yeah,
don't appreciate just how much the
yeah,
cost of some of these, top-end cancer
yeah,
drugs factors into the size of a trial. And if you're
yeah,
getting the China price versus the, Western price on that, that matters a lot. And I think people don't fully understand that. I know Tim Oppler over at Stifel was on a different podcast talking, recently about how, I think it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to enroll a U.S. patient in a cancer trial. And yeah, the cost and the speed in China just being so significantly lower. Sorry to interrupt you, but I think it's really important for us to hit on here.
Exactly. And also talking about the cost. So at this time, even if after like years, because nowadays we are having too many trials running in China simultaneously, right? So that's why the trial cost is definitely much higher compared to before. But still, I think it's much cheaper than the US. For example, I'm thinking of for a very large scale phase 3 trial, maybe the patient recruitment cost is like 5 million or something. It's still much cheaper than the US. But nevertheless, talking about the drug cost, it's also like Keytruda selling in China is like 80% cheaper than the US. So nowadays, for example, if you are a Kiso, you are doing the Keytruda head-to-head trial in China, is also much cheaper than the US. So that's why it's cheaper and faster. So that's the reason why we can save the cost. So I think multinational companies, so some of them, for example, I will use BMS, Bristol as an example. So they are also relying on their Chinese partners to do a lot of the trials in China to identify which is the right indication they really want to pursue in the US. So I guess this is definitely makes sense, either economically or maybe scientifically. So I guess that's the idea here.
So I another piece of this I want to get into, and I think we had the podcast with Zach Weinberg, who I think represents, and I'm sure you listened to it. He was arguing this case that you're starting to hear bubble up by some U.S. Venture capital investors and startup
Yeah,
CEOs that the US needs to do something to slow down these China transactions because, and the argument I think that he makes is, and it's not necessarily one that I agree with, but he's saying the US biotech industry is a gem and we need to protect it, and there are market forces at play that
yeah,
are going to be highly damaging in the long term, even if, and it might be advantageous to company balance sheets or to patient cost in the short term. I mean, his argument is like, hey, we've got to protect this thing. This is going to kill things in the long term before we can adjust if we don't do something here. I'm curious what you think of claims like
yeah.
that. I mean, I'm a pretty full-throated capitalist when it comes to this stuff, and I think it's hard to get around the market forces here, but there does seem to be this thread of argument of, hey, we shouldn't be doing these transactions, or we should be
Yeah.
slowing down these transactions or making them more expensive. What do you think about that? And what's the view in China about that argument to the extent people pay attention to it?
So indeed, Drew, actually starting from year beginning, we're hearing like increasing complaints about whether this will hurt the ecosystem of the US biotech industry. But actually, before we jump into that, I want to share with you some very interesting things. Because for example, we are talking about so why the multinational companies they're doing this with China biotech companies, and why Chinese companies they're good at this. So I just asked exactly the same question to ChatGPT. And so for most of the answer, it's quite straightforward, honestly, like cost, efficiency, like the diversity, whatever. But one thing I didn't expect, it is they mention about competition. So they think because the Chinese market, it is very competitive. So everybody, they are forced to trying to do something either different or innovative. I think this is actually very interesting. So yeah, back to Zach's point, whether you
Yeah.
should block this kind of competition from like Chinese companies or whatever companies from other side, um, honestly, I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, you bring up something that I actually think is really important, which is the competition. And I think people
yeah,
in the US biotech scene often view it as competition with the US, but there's also an enormous amount of China competition going on here, right? And that's playing out in some interesting ways in terms of, the speed at which companies are either pivoting or what they're keeping
yeah.
secret. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's, I think we, the folks, those of us who sit in the US often think about this purely through a kind of China v. US dynamic. And that isn't entirely, it's a much bigger picture than that. Yes.
So exactly. So yeah, let's keep on doing that. So first of all, for example, why we're talking about China market is very competitive because the thing is like again because we are sitting on a very large population base, and then because nowadays, for example, for maybe bispecific, like trispecific, or even ADCs, at this time we only have a handful targets which has been already validated, right? So definitely you can talking about where I'm trying some new things, new modality, but for the already validated one, you're definitely facing a lot of competition. For example, even for Akeso, like they're undisputable leaders in this PD-1 VEGF, but nowadays we are having like 40 PD-1 VEGF in China. 14 of them has already entered into clinical stage. So it is not that Chinese people, they want to compete with others. They're competing with each other. And I guess it is because of this competition. So that's why we're always talking about differentiation. Otherwise, you are just one of the 40s, right? So I
Yeah.
guess that is also very important.
Right. And you're not going to be able to, I mean, I think the other thing that I have long understood about the market in China, where obviously the population is huge and the need in cancer is huge, is that you're not going to be able to
Yeah,
compete unless you can come to market at a very, very low price. And that a lot of, I
exactly.
think, the cost around here is, a lot of it's driven by the China market dynamics more than
Yeah,
the, ex-China market dynamics. Can we return back to
yeah,
the data quality question? Because
yeah,
it's been interesting to see that come back up. The FDA commissioner was actually out, I believe, at a meeting in New York earlier this week, questioning the quality of Chinese data, saying if we can't trust their GDP data, why should we trust their healthcare data? And I think we've seen the FDA be pretty consistent for a while that you're not going to be able to use China data in order to, pure China data in order to get a drug approved. And that's partly just
yeah,
because they want to see, a reflection of the US population
yeah,
and the diversity there. Um, but I also think in some ways that argument is a little bit of and please fill this in, but a little bit of a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation of how this data is being used, because a lot of it is being used to kind of advance into phase one, phase two, or phase three in a multinational trial. Yeah, I mean a lot of
yeah,
what we're seeing this data, and you mentioned the Akisa data, Summit is going to be out there running, global
yeah,
trials in this in order to seek global approval. Am I
yeah.
understanding that correctly from the data quality standpoint? What are you? I mean, what's your take on some of those comments about data quality and the level of data quality we see in China right now?
Yeah, sure. So I would say like after 2018, the overall quality from Chinese data is definitely um, like see a lot of improvement because like the Chinese companies now they realize they really need to go overseas in order to have a more sustainable growth in the longer term. So that's the reason why they have this kind of pressure. And then like even like China FDA, we are also benchmarked to the US FDA standard. I mean, US FDA is definitely a golden standard. So that's why everybody they're trying to reach that golden standard. I mean, so for the Chinese biotech companies, because they aim globally. So that's the reason why they need to stick with the highest standard. So that is the first point. And secondly, I think the thing is definitely we will have some like not ideal data quality in China, but I think that is also applied to that maybe even if in US trial, like 90% of the trials will eventually fail, right? So that's the reason why if we if we do not consider this kind of sampling bias, I will say that, for example, Akeso and along with a bunch of the Chinese biotech leaders, they are definitely deliver very high data quality. Yeah.
Do you think we'll see, I think it's been really interesting to watch some of these companies in China grow, and I'm thinking particularly about Hungary, which has done kind of deal after deal. What does a kind of big global powerhouse China biopharma company look like in a year, in 2 years, or 5 years? What do you think is going to be the model for what, we talk a lot about, I think these licensing deals with smaller companies. Do you think we'll see kind of a big, multi-strategy, um, you know, international China company? And what does that look like? And does it look a lot different from what some of the European and US companies look like? And I mentioned Hungary, and I'm curious to get your take on them in that
Yeah.
context as well.
So unfortunately, I do not have a crystal ball to tell what's the dynamic will be like in 5 years' time. But from my 2 cents, will be so first of all, even Henry, we're talking about this is already the biggest pharma companies in China, is still quite small compared to a multinational company perspective, right? So that's the reason why I doubt whether we can call it a big pharma from the US angle. And then because for us, to like farmer, like they are already have a very mature product portfolio, and then they have a decent growth, like Henry, like Hanso, so they're definitely good. And in the meantime, because they can consistently deliver this kind of high quality out licensing. And on the other hand, we also have some good quality companies such as Akiso, such as Duality, such as B1. So they can also, like a pure R&D powerhouse, I think they will focus on those kind of more cutting edge technology, because they do not have this kind of, I won't say burden, but it's still a pressure that they need to maintain a very beautiful, like the profit growth chart for their shareholders. But I mean, I think I like both kind of companies, either pharma or biotech, as long as the company is decent, and then as long as they continue to investing into the like the new therapeutics, I think that's good enough. And also we do see that, because I'm calling that maybe 2025 and 2026 is a dystocking year for Hong Kong IPO. So now we also see a IPO market boom, and we will see a lot of the other very high quality companies, for example, into the renal diseases, into CNS, into like the siRNA. I do think a lot of Chinese companies, they're working towards that way.
I wanted to ask you about the capital markets, and you mentioned, we have seen this huge IPO boom and things like that. What is the state of the capital, the public and private capital markets right now in China biotech, and how should we think about, there's been this enormous growth. I think people cite this number of there's 5,000 Chinese biotechs out there. Are we seeing the capital return and new company formation cycle really starting to churn in a way that's going to send back money to entrepreneurs and funders and kind of keep this flywheel going? Like, what's going on in the capital markets there?
So great. So before we say 5,000 biotech is a big number, so let me give you a little bit background, because we're still having 13,000 pharma companies in China. So that's
Yeah.
the reason why I don't think like the 5,000 biotech is just too many. But anyway, back to maybe those kind of companies who will be on our radar. I would say like because nowadays people ask me whether you worry about, okay, either the global biotech funding or the China biotech funding has yet to pick up. But I mean, I quote from someone else, because as I mentioned, we have some repetitions in terms of the drug application or something. So honestly, I do not concern that much, because I do think that those kind of biotech funding, they should be put into the more like urgent need or medical needs, because I really want to see that maybe after like 5 years time, we have only like 3 to 5 companies doing exactly the similar thing, but more towards those kind of like cutting through, or maybe into some therapeutic breakthrough. Yeah.
Um, I think we have time for about two more questions. I think there's one thing I wanted to ask you about, and you mapped this out really nicely in your report of, where China biotech is focused right now in terms of
Yeah.
therapeutic area and modality. What do you think China, the China biotech, if you can kind of generalize a little bit, what they're particularly good at? And I asked that question with the background of, I think there's a lot of very fast evolving understanding of that here, and has been a lot of misunderstanding. If you talk to people in the US scene who were kind of paying attention to this 2 years ago, the conversation you would hear was, well, they're really good at, doing chemistry and ADCs. And then, 3 months would go by and you would find out about some company doing, some kind of really interesting genetic medicine. And they'd say, well, they're doing this, but, they're not good at this other really advanced thing. And then 3 months would go by and, we had our reporter Ryan Cross had written about some, company doing that thing that they were supposedly not good at. And I think there's kind of this every, few months, people have to reset their understanding and expectations
Yeah.
about exactly what's going on there. And I'm sure we'll be having a new understanding of that in 3 months. But when you look at the landscape right now and you follow this really closely, what do you think the things that China biotech is really, really good at, therapeutic area modality? How would you describe that to somebody who was, who was coming over there and trying to understand the market better?
Yes, so great one. So I would say this answer, I need to update it, maybe at least annually, right? So because for example, like 7 years ago, I cannot imagine that maybe like the guys like Akeso, they are bold enough to run a Keytruda head-to-head trial. So that is some breakthrough here already. But I would say at this stage, I think Chinese companies, they are good at to do a lot of like the optimization regarding a validated modality. So I think maybe after 5 years, we will have some further breakthrough into like the new modality exploration. But at this stage, so that's the reason why with this kind of bispecific ADC boom, you may see Chinese players, they're definitely taking the dominant position here globally. And on the other hand, as I point out in my report, that at this time, I think bispecific ADC in the oncology area is definitely one of the most popular area. So aside from that, like the oral GLP-1s as well as orexin, these are all the other like rising stars among the Chinese companies.
A last question for you. I think I've been operating in the assumption that there's kind of historically been four big, we talked about this, big centers of kind of biopharma in the world, Boston and San Francisco, the New York, New Jersey area for pharma and Europe for pharma as well. I have really started thinking about China as a fifth one of those, but what do you think the biggest risk to the China sector is right now?
Great one. So still, as a China analyst, the most discussed topic or question asked for me is it still, so how do you see this kind of Sino-US tension or something? But I mean, for the China biotech out licensing, I tend to believe it is sustainable because I guess like by the nature of this kind of partnership, like Chinese companies, they are only entitled to 10% of the US drug sales. So it is the US farmer who are keeping majority of the economics. So I don't think the US government will have an issue with that. But like I mentioned, if we need to point out some of the risk factors, I would say maybe the concerns about the geopolitical concern is definitely one of them. But I also want to highlight here because last year everybody is talking about the Biosecure Act, right? So Biosecure Act, as we know, that is officially expired January 3rd this year. But more importantly, it is actually the only anti-China legislation which has not been passed by US Senate last year. So I guess this kind of like, I don't know, it is relationship bonding or maybe the US pharma companies, they still have a lot of like in order to pursue this kind of cost flexibility, as I mentioned, I do think they want to achieve this together with some of their Chinese partners.
Well, I unfortunately have to leave it there. I will be talking a lot more about this. Cui, thank you so much for being with us. She is the head of Asia Healthcare Research at Jefferies. She is a must-read on this topic. Thank you. I hope we'll have you back sometime soon. That is all the time we have for today, everybody. Thank you for joining
Thank
us.
you, Ju.
We are going to be following these topics closely as always. You can keep up with our coverage at endpoints.news or by subscribing to our newsletters. The recording of this conversation is on YouTube, and the audio will be up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts a little bit later today. If you are already signed up for our Post-Hoc newsletter, you'll get notifications when we have a new broadcast coming up. And if you're not signed up, head over to endpoints.news. And then in the top right-hand corner, you'll hit the reader profile link, then preferences, and then click to activate Post-Hoc. You can also follow us on X, LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and Blue Sky by searching for Endpoints News. A huge thank you to our producer, Nicole Wetzman, and our engineer, Dalen Turk. This has been Post-Hoc Live. We will see you the next time news breaks.